Okay, hello everyone. Closing act. I'm going to try and be brief. This is going to be very hectic, fast talk because I get bored very fast and my attention span has been destroyed. So without further ado, let's begin. Respecting your player, or how to bring engagement back to mainstream gaming, by me, Stoyan Stoyanov. Yes, that's my real name. Yes, my parents are very creative. You can find me on all the usual social media stuff or just catch me roaming around. First, who am I and why should you care about anything I say? I began doing experimental and weird stuff. So first it was VR, then it was educational things, ARGs, 2D, mobile games, dark period of my life. And then I went to AAA. I was a quest designer for CD Projekt Red, working on Cyberpunk and some ND8 stuff. Then I worked briefly for Techland, primarily on their fantasy project. And I am currently the game director of Jyamma Games, working on Enotria, The Last Song, which is a Mediterranean take on the Souls-like genre. And I'm going to tell you how all of these things connect. So, first we begin with a little bit of retrospective. In the very beginning of the game industry, most things were arcade machines. Computers were expensive, it was hard to get the hardware in order to play games. So everything was driven by making money, and this involved designs that were purposefully obscure, difficult, and meant to make you so frustrated that you want to keep going, kind of how modern social media works. This model, of course, evolved into the 90s when computers and consoles became a little bit more mainstream. We started having 3D for the very first time. Games started to push the boundaries of what was possible, but primarily we were kind of just doing whatever we could whenever there was new exciting technology. Again, we would just jump on the bandwagon and see what we can do with it. Until a very important project called Half-Life started questioning, what if we don't just mix together tools and don't care about the end result? What if we try and give it some context, give it some framing, and then open up an entirely different aspect of the industry where for the first time we start seriously thinking about context, narrative, etc. And cinematics, which were the bane of my existence in AAA, which we'll go back to a little bit later. Then we get to another questionable period of history, the early 2000s, which are making a reluctant comeback nowadays. This is when we went into mature. This is our Hollywood wannabe era of gaming, where everything became very dark, very brown, and very like a worse version of that movie that you saw that was kind of cool. We also made huge leaps in terms of technology. We started having dual-core processors, things exploded. So for the first time, we could do more realistic approaches to shading, to aesthetics. And this, of course, led into a completely different style of making games. Before, it was really hard to get emotionally invested in the Doom guy when he's a bunch of 10 angry pixels on your screen. But suddenly, we had cinematics, motion capture, blah, blah, blah. And of course, this also happened with consoles. It was a very troubled generation. I think some of you hopefully remember the PS3 had a very ambitious processor that was meant to revolutionize gaming, and in the end, it just ended up being too difficult to work with. So once again, we were kind of jumping the shark a little bit and trying to do whatever we can with tech. One cool thing that we did, however, is because of CPU, it was a golden era for simulation and immersive stuff, because that's mostly handled on the CPU side. So because we couldn't have incredible graphics, we tended to do a lot of cool stuff like this, that unfortunately went away when GPUs caught up and eclipsed. And this is why a lot of modern games, for example, for a long time looked really pretty, but the moment you touched it, everything fell apart. And you know, some things went arguably a little bit too far. But let's move on. 2010s, basically big. It was just big. Like everything was big. What if it's 3 times the size? Let's make it bigger. Let's make it grander. No real question about whether that improves things in any way, but there was just this misguided association that just because we can do open worlds now, we should go wild with it. This kind of plagued us for a very long time, also because on the business side of things, people started equating playtime with value for money and spectacle. We started getting games like Uncharted, Last of Us, games that truly blurred the line between movies and the interactive medium, for better or for worse, depending on what kind of gamer you are, but they were also a trap. So basically, the 2 primary forms of, again, mainstream gaming were open worlds and extremely cinematic stuff, both of which have one common thing. They're really expensive. So what happens now? We have some worrying trends. People have turned quite hostile towards mainstream stuff. It's primarily indies, smaller experimental things. And there's good reason for that. With budgets that went from 20 to 50 million in the early 2000s, now we're at 200 million plus. That's for development alone without marketing. There's increasingly diminishing returns in visuals. You have to spend so much time making these hyper-realistic graphics and characters that you end up cutting down content, cutting down ambition, cutting down on iteration. So you have simpler games, more straightforward ones, and ones that take less and less risks, because how the hell are you going to make 300 million back by taking risks, right? Designed by committee, big games require big teams, so you end up having a lot of people that mingle, so you get a lot of these like authored crazy things. Remember a lot of the early Kojima stuff, Shadow of the Colossus, things like this would be very difficult to exist now because they were kind of almost AAA scale, but very bizarre and creative. And nowadays, everything has to be supported by metrics and business reasons. And this is one of the reasons why public opinion has shifted quite dramatically. If you notice, most of the old legends of the 90s and early 2000s, whether it's EA, BioWare, Blizzard, etc., not very beloved nowadays, and there's a good reason for this. What made them unique back then was scaled into oblivion. They just made increasingly bigger versions of the old stuff without meaningfully evolving it in any way. However, not all hope is lost. So let's break it down quickly. Reality is crashing down, but we have the good, the bad, and I don't remember my next slide, the promising. The good, we have the tools of the future. It's easier than ever to make amazing games. We have stuff like Unreal Engine 5 that gives us procedural tech, Lumen, Nanite. It enables smaller teams to make big games and high-quality games. I would argue that nowadays with AA, if you have 30, 40 people and good tech knowledge, you no longer have to compromise in basically any way, as long as you're realistic with your idea. This is awesome, because now you need a smaller budget, and you can risk much more in a way that you couldn't before, and it opens you up to new genres that were impossible in the past. With the double-edged sword that, remember, Unreal Engine and Unity and all of these companies are public, so of course it's in their best interest to make their tech look really awesome and to tell you that it's going to take one click to make it work. And then you lose several years of development time. So it is tricky, but it is hopeful. We also have better hardware than ever. I think it says a lot about the industry that one of the most popular hardware devices nowadays is a PC. Most games are going multi-platform, even publishers like Sony. So in this sense, I think we are in a very exciting period for game dev that is going to be difficult for AAA. It's difficult for a lot of game devs, as you know, with layoffs and cut downs on budget. But in terms of creativity for games, we have no limits anymore. CPUs, GPUs, everything is more powerful than ever. There's more platform parity. And we no longer have to limit ourselves in the same way as before. So this gives us endless possibility, terrifying, horrible. So it's the reason why indie games have eclipsed a lot of AA and AAA games. The majority of the most successful games, if you watched the Summer Games Fest recently, as old Jeff Keighley said, most of them are independent projects. And there's a good reason why these companies that are sometimes one dude in his basement are outselling the biggest franchises in the world. Because when you don't have the technical limitations to hold you back, it's just about your idea. Small teams can dream big, and it's all about creativity, and people are really hungry for change. Because for a long time, as I said, we haven't been fundamentally changing the kind of games we make. We've just been making them prettier and bigger. So when something new comes out, it's very, very exciting, right? And at the same time, there's also smaller teams of veterans, like the people making Hades, for example, that can now reach the same level of fidelity as a large publisher as long as they're realistic with their goals. So whether you go weird or you go hyper-polished, it's the age of indies, pretty much. And this is why I think it's really important to consider pivoting at a larger scale. We need to be bolder with our visions, and there's really no time to hesitate. I'm going to be looping back on this at the end of it, but I think if you're AAA, you should be really worried, because if your game takes 8 years to make and costs 300 million, and you need to base it off current trends, by the time you come out, that trend is like 5 years in the past. There is no way you can keep up if you're chasing what's hot right now. You need to be bold, you need to be unique, and you need to do something really different. Otherwise, there's no way, again, 5, 6, 7, 8 years in the future, your game is still going to be relevant to people. Okay, a little bit about the bad. I'm just going to double check my time. Okay, we've gone to a very problematic direction because bigger budgets meant we need bigger audiences. So we've tried to streamline things and optimize. And this is a very business and marketing related push because the logic was games need to be easier and smoother to play. Friction makes a person quit. They go to the competitor's product. Many things go live service, so you want to keep them playing the product. All the boring, horrible things that creative people hate. But it is true. Nowadays, games are very automatic. One test that I like to do as a designer is whatever cool stuff is happening on screen, to try and look at the player's hands. Is all the cool stuff happening while they're just pressing the stick forward? Are they just tapping one button every 15 seconds? Then you've lost them already. Because now you're entirely relying on whatever's on screen being so cool that even though they're mechanically asleep, they're still engaged. And at that point, you're essentially competing with movies and stuff that are much better than you. So I think it's really important to consider input. This means everything as basic as control schemes and whether you should just go default and copy everything that exists out there, or whether you should require a little bit more mechanical effort from players to keep them engaged. Don't be afraid of challenging players. This is an old business trap that we fell into with large mainstream products. Trust me, look at the recent best-selling games. People are not afraid to try something weird. They're not afraid to learn. In fact, they love it. What they do hate is when every single game controls the same, plays the same, and requires nothing from you. Like, for example, old-school RPGs, a lot of times were purposefully quite obscure, obtuse. It was very easy to mess up. But the thing is, messing up, being so easy, meant that when you did get things right, it felt good, right? It wasn't just because the best option is always highlighted for you and it's functionally impossible. And this is a really key thing. You need to raise the stakes. There's been a fear of alienating players. There's this paranoia. For example, if you make a cool set piece and it costs this much dev time and this much money, people can't miss it. They need to see it. We need to give them a button to press that makes them look at the thing. We need to trap them in a room so they hear all the dialogue that was really expensive because we hired Hollywood actors for no obvious reason. And it's not true. You will not alienate people by making stuff harder, by giving them the ability to fail, or by letting them get a little bit frustrated here and there. Because friction is part of the experience. Otherwise, you're just gliding through completely oblivious to anything that's happening in the game. And the last thing, this is a personal pet peeve of mine, so I'm not going to go into a half-hour rant about this, but loot economies and general progression in games has developed in a really nasty way because we've tried to make longer games, and the best way we could think about how to do that was to add RPG mechanics and loot to everything. So consider whether your game needs this, trim the fat, please, because not every game needs to have a crafting mechanic, and your gun being upgraded by 0.1% really doesn't add anything to Alan Wake, I'm sorry. So you could have an incredible 30-hour game, or you could have a bloated mess for 50 hours. And those 20 hours, trust me, will not make people recommend your game to other people, and you're going to lose out on a lot of sales and a lot of potential because of this. Of course, this doesn't apply to games as a service, but that's not my forte, so I'm just going to gloss over that one. So again, less is more. Just really think carefully about what you need, and don't go on autopilot when designing games. Don't just box yourself into, I'm making this genre, so I'm going to have this structure that everybody does, this control scheme, this economy. You know, does God of War really need the ability to change Kratos' pants to help him deal 5% more axe damage? I'll let you answer that question for yourself. And yeah, this results in a lot of things like this. Nobody's going to be, oh man, I wish this game had more things that waste my time in between all the stuff I actually care about, whether it's cutscenes or combat or so on. The player should not be a sentient Hoover. I know we've had the, what is the usual phrase used for it? The murder hobo player archetype, where you just go around and you click on everything, get everything, kill everything. What we've done with these mechanics is because each individual thing has so little impact, we've taught players to just completely switch off their brain. They just run around, they pick up everything, they craft whatever is glowing and they can craft, and they just absolutely disengage with all the mechanics in the game. So again, just try to make sure you don't put the necessary stuff, because it detracts from the good things in your game. Because if your player is already on autopilot because they just spent 15 minutes in an inventory screen, you're going to need to work a lot to pull them back in when the next encounter starts or the next cutscene or whatever your game needs. And the next thing is too many set pieces. Not going to talk about this too much, but when I worked on Cyberpunk, I lamented a lot that there were a lot of sequences like this unfortunate thing that I had to work on. They were actually completely scripted. They took months of dev effort. They took so much time. But for a player, it's a chase scene that takes maybe 60 to 90 seconds, and then they forget about it. So be careful. They're prohibitively expensive, and have as few set pieces as you possibly can, because when you try to compete with other games in terms of set pieces, are you really going to outdo Avengers or Last of Us? Probably not. People are super overexposed. Even franchises like Call of Duty that have an incredibly high level of fidelity, people were complaining about new Call of Duty games that they're not up to par just because they've seen extremely polished stuff and high fidelity stuff for so long that it's become normal. So the moment you try to compete with them on that playing field, you better make sure you're better than them. Otherwise, it's just hurting your game. So just know your strengths. Again, just ask yourself, did Uncharted do it better? Probably, yes. But actually, yes, please. Just don't try to outdo them at their own game. Spending 8 months of dev time on a chase scene that's just objectively worse than any proper one doesn't get you anywhere and just detracts from cool content that you could have otherwise added to the game. That was a weird thing about ice cream in Poland, not culturally relevant, pretend you didn't see it. Now to some of the promising stuff. We're going back to basics in a lot of ways, because there's this freedom for creativity thanks to the new tech and thanks to indies being younger and more capable than ever. We have people like a single guy who used to make Roblox mods, making Lethal Company, and outselling all of the big AAAs. So we can have a very simple improvement formula that sometimes you can get lost when you've been in the industry for so long that you get used to doing things a certain way, and then some young kid comes out of nowhere and blows you out of the water, and you're like, oh my God, I completely forgot. I just took so many things for granted, and I myself as a developer started going on autopilot. So evaluate the main actions. This is not the core loop. This is not the boring production developer stuff. I mean literally what you will be doing constantly. This might not be your core loop. If you design your game really poorly, in fact, it might not be the core loop at all. You need to add nuance, which is not the same as complexity. It means that actions need to have a little bit of leeway to them. They should never be extremely straightforward and automatic unless you want them to be completely in the background. So for example, if you have a gear upgrade economy, having no nuance to it, making it super easy, streamlined, you don't have to think about it, why does it exist? This is meant to be one of the most exciting parts of the game. Getting new stuff, upgrading it, you've just effectively defeated the purpose of it. And you see a lot of big titles constantly reworking stuff, like let's say Diablo 3, and funnily enough 4 as well, that have had to rework their entire gear economies because they just went too far into streamlining stuff. And the last thing, as I mentioned earlier, just add stakes. Failure must always be an option. You know, it's a bit of an extreme take from me, but I really strongly believe on this. Without failure, there's no stakes. Without stakes, why am I playing? Why is this not a cutscene, right? If I cannot fail the action, then why am I even told to press the button? Is it just to keep me awake? It's the video game input equivalent of zapping you with electricity every 15 seconds. And yeah, for example, in Cyberpunk, you know, the expectation was this power fancy, you're going to do all this cool stuff everywhere. And the reality was you were just kind of walking around, picking up bottles and getting lost a bunch and shooting guys over and over because you need XP to get the next thing and so on. And that's, nobody was excited about this game because of this stuff, right? So be careful, because sometimes what you think is your selling point and your core loop isn't actually. And the last thing is simulation. I'm a big simulation geek. I love Deus Ex. My background was technical. So I'm really happy that we're going back to simulation stuff, because as I mentioned, in the mid-2000s, there were a lot of games that lean into this, whether it's Crysis or Far Cry or so on. And then we went very on the GPU side. So for a long time, we had very pretty set dressing that didn't do anything. We had gorgeous games, but you couldn't interact with them in any way. They didn't react to you in any way. And this is one of the cool things that you can do now. CPUs, again, are more powerful than ever. consoles are the least CPU bound they've ever been. We have stuff like the Steam Deck, we have platform parity, and this means you can really go wild with the stuff, because one of the cool things is that there's a big gap in the market right now. And you see that a lot of the most successful games of recent times, whether it's AAA like Baldur's Gate or something like Lethal Company, are effectively digital playgrounds. I'm not saying you need to turn every game into Deus Ex, but I'm saying that leaning more into reactivity is a really good way to stand out in the market right now, and there's a pretty good precedent for it with technology and with what people are looking for. Because playgrounds are just fun, right? People nowadays, they need to interact with things because they have so many passive forms of media, whether it's being bombarded with streaming services or your little Doom obelisk that you passively scroll through every day. So if you want to get their attention, you need to surprise them and you need to react to them, because this is the one thing that games do that other mediums don't, right? When you push them, they should push back. And again, people love it. I mean, how much discussion was there about CS2 adding a literal volumetric cloud? And it was the most exciting thing that happened to this genre of multiplayer gaming in 20 years. And it was a cloud because you could shoot through it and it reacted to players moving through it. And yes, if you do want to make more Deus Ex games, please do. Nobody wants to fund them. I'm very sad about it. Okay, big words, small steps. I'm going to go very quickly through this one. There's a concept in Japanese and in general, like Eastern narrative, that's called Kisho Tenketsu. It's, well, I did try to pronounce it and I butchered it, but it's a classic structure for their narrative. It's very different from Western ones. In Western storytelling, like hero's myth and all this stuff, generally there always is a conflict, resolution, etc. In Eastern storytelling, sometimes they have stories that we would say, what's the point? Is just a guy going around and doing stuff. I think this is something to consider on all levels of game development, not just narrative structures, which, to be fair, you should probably keep traditional if you're selling your game in the West. But I mean that there's a lot of mini loops of setup and twist. For example, if you look at every single quest in Witcher 3, each one of them follows this super basic pattern. They hook you, they introduce something to you, and then they twist, right? Like you're hunting for a werewolf, but turns out the werewolf has a wife who's super sad, and actually he's a really cool guy, so maybe you have a few beers with him, and you're like, you know what, maybe the human was the asshole. You know, so very basic structure, but we tend to forget this. Whether you're making a quest, a gameplay mechanic, whatever, try to defy expectations a bit, because that's how you hook people long-term and you keep them engaged. And exactly, just don't use it for narrative. I think being with technical background and then moving into narrative, I was surprised to find how many programming or tech-related approaches actually completely work on pure creative stuff like art or narrative as well. Okay, enough theory. Now on to the slightly more interesting part of the talk, at least for me. One problem I have with a lot of design talks is that programmers are really good at giving you actionable stuff. You watch a programmer talk and you can basically just apply it. Artists are also pretty good at explaining stuff, or at least they give you pretty things to look at. A lot of designer talks, they tell you a lot of stuff that you nod and you say like, yeah, that makes sense. But then what do you do with it, right? So one thing I like to do in my talks is a solid final chunk of the talk is dedicated to case studies, which are examples of how different companies applied these ideas in different contexts, and hopefully at least one of those will be relevant to your situation, and you'll go like, you know what, we could do something like this. First one, a slightly more controversial one, Days Gone. This was a game that was completely trashed by the critics and journalists because it was just another zombie game, yet somehow it sold millions, and it has an overwhelmingly positive review rate on Steam. So how come this generic zombie game with a middling story managed to grab people? And even have one of the most impressive sales tales of Sony games. A lot of Sony games peak very hard, and then they just kind of drop off into oblivion, and they eventually get moved on to PS Plus. The reason is that there was more to this game than the high-level narrative stuff and the boring things. It was actually secretly a simulation game. You were playing a biker, and they could have forced it on you with how he looks, how he talks, and the narrative, and they kind of tried. But the main thing was you had a bike, right? What is the thing that a biker would care the most about? It's your bike. So they made it a living thing in ways that could be seen as counterintuitive, frustrating to the players. This bike was your mount. You could not summon it. Wherever you leave it, that's where it stays. It could get damaged and severely crippled to the point that you cannot use it. You had to find fuel and refuel it. You could idle it to save fuel or even to not alert zombies. And the zombies themselves had hordes that had procedural AI, and they were roaming the map in dynamic ways. So if you start a quest, a horde could get attracted, and suddenly this quest that could otherwise be easy could be a complete nightmare because you pulled in a gigantic horde of zombies. So again, one of the reasons I think this generic zombie game was so successful is because it defied expectations. It gave some systemic play. It felt like the game is reacting to you, and as a result, it felt a lot more interesting than even objectively better games that were more traditional, whether it's an Assassin's Creed or a Ghost of Tsushima, or things that were very functionally well put together, but fundamentally almost everybody was having the exact same experience. So think about this, even in the biggest AAA game, even with things that you think could be super frustrating, like on paper, this is horrible. Why the hell would I want to remember where my bike is? I would have to walk all the way back. I would have to fix it. I have to refuel all this stuff. But what it did is it meant that players were constantly engaged. They never went on autopilot like in other open world games. They never just clicked the mount button and then just zone out with a podcast while they get to the next destination. You as a biker always cared about your bike. It was the most important thing you had. Running out of fuel, it getting damaged, taking care for it, it felt really cool because when you succeeded, you knew you could have failed. And on the flip side, when you upgraded it, you felt really excited because it felt like an extension of you. And this is the story of how a bike in a B-tier game had more characterization than the average AAA protagonist. The next one is Sons of the Forest. So this is a sequel to a multiplayer game. A lot of people have heard about this game. Very few people know just how successful it is. It's one of the best-selling games of all time. It has outsold many of the most famous franchises that you know, and there is a very good reason for it. Again, it's a very saturated market, right? Survival multiplayer games. But one of the things and the reasons it stood out is because it had this really interesting procedural AI. So basically in the game, you're dropped into the forest, which has things of unspeakable nature. So while you're trying to chop down trees and build stuff and all the common things, you had these creatures of the forest that were reacting to you. And in fact, the different tribes could change their behavior based on how you were treating them. So if you were very aggressive to them, they would be aggressive to you. And in fact, you could make the game a lot harder for yourself by antagonizing different tribes. And as a result, they had all these little systemic touches that made the game feel really alive and believable to people and helped it stand out from the billion different, like, now you're surviving, but it's in the Arctic. Now you're surviving, but it's on the moon. And you're chopping moon trees or whatever. And then they made a sequel, which was equally as successful. And the reason is that they knew what to lean into. They made so much money, they could have put, I don't know, they could have had Chris Hemsworth play the tree. But they didn't. They didn't add cutscenes, they didn't go extremely high fidelity. What they did is they leaned into the stuff that they knew players liked, so they had better AI, and they also did one of the coolest improvements to the core actions that I've ever seen. For example, chopping down a tree, it's a thing you do in pretty much every single survival game. They made an entire system where every single impact of the axe removes a dedicated chunk of the tree that completely determines in which way it's going to fall. The tree itself is a physics object that behaves really nicely. And even construction and building involves physically grabbing wooden blocks and chopping them down manually into different shapes. So it was very involved for a player. It felt very organic. And I think they were really smart in not scaling up in ways they didn't have to, and instead looking at what are the things you constantly do in these games. And now that we have all the money, how can we completely outclass all of our competition? Because yeah, realistically, this is what you're going to be doing for like 80% of the game. You would just be going around chopping trees. And yeah, for example, this is a quick demonstration of their building model. So they created this entire system where you can place wood, and depending on how you angle and where you aim your axe, you can dynamically modify the size and scale. You can cut logs into planks and all this sort of stuff. Is it a gimmick? Yeah, effectively, this could have been a menu, but it feels cool, doesn't it? I mean, you're going to be spending half of the game building stuff with all the trees you chop down, and it feels really cool thinking that you're the guy building it. You're manually selecting each individual aspect, and the game feels really reactive because instead of a menu, it's a physical object. Next, Sea of Thieves. I'm going to go really fast through this one because I think it's fairly obvious. Now it's very successful. When I originally mentioned this game, it wasn't so. But yeah, turns out if you make a sailing game, and again, some big AAAs should maybe have thought about this when they're making pirate games or sailing games. Turns out how it feels to sail the ship and how the water looks and behaves is the most important thing. Sea of Thieves is fundamentally an extremely simple game. You just have a boat and you go around on water and you kill some skeletons. That's the entire game. So how does it keep people for so long? Other than the fact that you have a crew of people and there's a lot of interesting human interactions, it's also fundamentally a systemic game. There's storms in the game, there's giant sea creatures, the weather can shift, the wind keeps moving. It doesn't ask a lot of you. It's still a casual game that has, I don't know, like 10 million active users. So it's not some hardcore simulator. But it means that you never fall asleep at the wheel sailing a ship. You're never just pressing forward in this game. It always asks you to do little adjustments that make you think just that little bit, like which way am I going? I need to reference the map, see which direction I'm going. Oh, the wind changed directions. I need to tell my friend to like turn the sails, or we need to raise them so we slow down a little bit. It's these small actions and these systemic components that allowed them to create a game that aged super gracefully, because graphics get old, cutscenes get old, story get old, but systems and interesting interactivity is the reason people still play Warcraft 3 or Heroes of Might and Magic 3 and all those old games that were much more systems driven. Because this is fundamentally one of the most exciting things in games, right? And again, this solid foundation also allowed them to very elegantly support the game in the future. Because once you have this, people stay and people are engaged, and then all you need to do is pretty much just make content. They haven't fundamentally changed the game in any way in like the 5 years it's existed, and it's even more popular now than when it released. And again, realistically, you could say, was it really worth it spending an entire year making the water? Yeah, you're sailing a ship, Ubisoft. Like you could have, look at it. People still play this game just to sail around and look at the water. So think about, again, the action you'll be performing the most, and that's the one thing that you can go extremely over scope on, and it will never end up badly. Okay, next case study, Dying Light 1 and 2. So when I worked at Techland, just to make it clear, I did not really work on any of those games. I supported a bit the sequel. But I find them very interesting for one reason. You could say, again, they were kind of a generic zombie game. So how come Dying Light 1 was so successful? Successful enough to scale up the entire studio and have a sequel, etc. It's a game that sold over 10 million copies. And it's literally the most generic zombie game you can think of. And it's because, again, it had a lot of systemic elements. The trick is in the name, right? Dying Light. It has a day-night cycle. Enemies become more dangerous at night. Narratively and systemically, the entire game revolves around daytime and nighttime. And you better be sure that you are safe when nighttime hits, because everything gets super scary. All the enemies become much more challenging, etc. It was a very simple twist to the formula, but it meant that everything you're doing, there's this extra thing you have to keep attention of. You always need to know what time of day it is, and it doesn't feel as gimmicky as other implementations. And another thing was the parkour was really more involved and punishing. In the beginning of the game, you could barely vault over a surface. I mean, you were functionally the average American. Like you got winded running down a small alleyway. And by the end of the game, you had a grappling hook, you could run everywhere, and you felt like an Assassin's Creed protagonist. But the reason that felt so cool is because in the beginning you were struggling so much. So you remember how 2 zombies and a chest-high wall were your biggest opponent. And then suddenly you're like firing off things, you're wall running, and all these other cool stuff that you have in other games. So remember, that little bit of friction is what made all the other stuff feel so impactful, and is the reason people connected so much with, again, a fairly unimpressive visually and pretty generic zombie game. And this thing with the second game is that they once again leaned into their strengths. So they maybe went a little bit too hard on the narrative side of things, which nobody asked for, let's be real. But they really improved the parkour in every single way, and they made it very systemic and procedural. So one of the things I love about this game is that every upgrade in the game requires you to do a thing. I will explain. So let's say you unlock the upgrade where if you fall from a great height, now you can roll to avoid the fall damage. You need to press a button. You unlock the ability that when you're vaulting off a pole, you can now launch to go further. You need to press a button. It's extremely easy to press that button. It's very lenient. It's almost impossible to fail the timing, actually. But it gives the player enough to do and the illusion of being really cool, because again, instead of these things happening automatically because you just unlock the skill and then your character is just better at it, but functionally you're still pressing forward, it meant that as you're doing all these things on screen, you're constantly thinking about what button to press when and how to do it. So when you do pull it off, it just feels so much cooler and more rewarding, again, because we haven't let the player fall asleep at the wheel. And I think this is a problem that a lot of big games can fall into, where upgrades are just automatic improvements to things you can do. And I think this is a cool approach that universally was quite praised and helped take out a lot of the monotony, because this is a game that you do parkour in for 80% of the time. So giving you something to do while it's happening just objectively improved the game for most people. Next one, ooh, my favorite. Cyberpunk 2077. It had a difficult launch, but it also had the 2.0 and then eventually the expansion and all the different fixes. So what they did in order to fix it is they knew that some of the most important stuff we worked on, like narrative or quests, were already pretty solid. But other than the game being broken, there were just a lot of things that didn't work. The core loop was pretty boring. The gameplay didn't really fit in with the power fantasy and all this sort of stuff. And a lot of people were asking for more systemic reactivity because, of course, the game was compared to GTA, which is a simulation masterpiece, and it's one of the advantages of Rockstar. So what they did is they basically did a coordinated assault of sorts, which was really clever of them. Remember, we live in transmedia times, which means that we have adaptations, we have social media, we have games on different platforms in different contexts. And I think they were really clever with the way that they timed an expansion with a big upgrade for the core game, with the anime releasing, and all these things combined brought all these different people from different chunks of the gaming spectrum back into the game to check it all out. If they did any of them individually, it would have had a much lesser effect. And from a pure business point of view, this could have been seen as a really stupid thing. Like, we put all this effort in all these three things. Aren't they going to cannibalize each other? Doesn't work this way. Our attention span is already nuked. You can give us 10 things and we would still be engaged by them. In fact, the more you give players, the more interested they are nowadays. And the other thing was that it was quite tight and focused. They spent less time, they reduced the scope, they didn't crunch, they just focused on reasonable expectations and going back to basics and polishing up everything that was in there. And most of it was player feedback. They tried to go through forums, they hired some people from the modding teams, and they looked through all the things that people requested. And if they did something bigger, like vehicle combat, they only did it because they saw that an overwhelming majority of the players really wished certain aspects of the game were improved, like this one. I would have killed to have had this when I was making the Nomad storyline, by the way, but live and learn. And as an end result, the game had a redemption arc, right? Maybe not as dramatic as something like No Man's Sky, but the overall consensus is that nowadays, if you ask most people, it's a decent game. Like, the opinion is positive, which is a far cry from when we originally shipped it several years ago. So again, even for the biggest games that are extremely narrative-led, in the end, like, world reactivity and progression ended up being the most engaging part of the title. When they redid the combat, they made most passive skills into active ones, and they made a really complex melee fighting system, and just in general, again, made sure you're not falling asleep at the wheel, which was the case with the original release, where most upgrades were just straightforward boosts. Not to mention, of course, the cyberpsychosis stuff that tied into the anime, where if you put too many upgrades, you risk going psycho, so there's some incentive to balance what you have equipped. Okay, once again, pretty successful. And also keep in mind, you're always going to be compared to your closest thing. So even if you're not GTA, if you look like GTA, you're going to be compared to GTA, and it's not going to work out in your favor because Rockstar have infinite money. Next one, a little bit of a curveball here. I just need to double check time. We're going into the VR space, and I'm going to speed up. Just to show you that it doesn't matter, it's not just about like AAA games. Even in VR, you need to innovate. It's a small market, so you could say it's not saturated, so it's not that hard to stand out when there's like 3 games coming out every year. However, Valve does things as Valve do, so they always carefully think about it and don't assume anything. So one of the things they did is they inherently understood the importance of input. It's a VR game. It's even more important than usual. Because falling asleep with a controller is even worse when, well, in VR, you basically just stand like an NPC, like if there's nothing happening, and you really feel this. So what they did is they designed the entire game around tactile feedback and moving things around. Valve does a lot of playtesting, so when they initially did playtesting, they found out that all the things they thought people would care about, like the continuation of the Half-Life story, nobody was really paying attention. Like when you were getting new lore about what should have been Half-Life 3, what should have been super exciting, people were just looking the other way and like kicking a ball on the ground because it was moving. And this is a reason why playtests are super important, and you need to swallow your ego and like realize that sometimes you make wrong assumptions because of previous experience. And they ended up reworking most of the game. They cut a lot of scope from quests and storylines and areas and focused all of it on making almost every single piece of the game interactive. And as a result, they made even mundane things like looking for loot super interesting, because now you physically rummage through spaces, open up things, turn over containers. And it was a really clever way of focusing on input and turning something mundane into a strength in the VR space. I have never been more excited to rummage through bins than I was in this game. And this led to insane things. Like, for example, there was a math teacher that taught an entire VR class. And it's because Valve, for Valve reasons, made all the markers in the whiteboards fully functional. And this gives you more attention and more consumer goodwill than any cutscene or set piece or anything else ever could. Moving on swiftly. Okay. Next is Lethal Company. I'm going to go very quickly through this one. Solo dev, comes from Roblox, no expectations. This man is functionally insane, and we all love him for it. He used to make horror games, then he made comedy games, and then he thought, what if I combine them together? And because he had no dev experience, he had no fundamental knowledge, he had nothing to stop him, really. And he ended up making one of the most successful games of last year, because he understood the importance of emergent gameplay. He leaned into the stuff that he knew well. He had an audio background, so he focused on positional audio from players and a lot of filters that happen whether you're on radio, behind a wall, etc. And this was the underpinning of why this game was so fun, because it's a multiplayer horror game in which it's purposefully frustrating for players. Most actions you can do, you can very easily mess up, and most times you mess up, you end up killing your friend. And he realized that instead of being frustrating, this is actually the whole unique selling point of the game. It's just funny when you mess up in such a context, right? So, for example, when you have to open a door, you don't just press a button. Your friend has to tell you over a walkie-talkie, and then you have to type out the name of the door correctly. And if you mess up, you're going to hear screaming on the other side, and then you're going to hear him unmute in Discord, and the screaming is going to continue with a slightly different context. And this is a really good example of how a single guy scoped perfectly and focused on systemic elements and ended up making a game that millions and millions of players were playing incessantly, even though it had like 3 procedural maps of almost no variation and only a handful of enemies. And it's because he had the experience from experimenting before, and he knew how to limit things that didn't matter. For example, most of the content and the new things in the game are done in a literal computer terminal where you type stuff out, and it's one of the most brilliant ways I've ever seen to limit UI scope. I know probably any UI designer will cry looking at this, but it was really functional and it was really smart because, yeah, if you're one guy and you want to keep adding features, you can do whatever you want. It's just text on a screen, right? And the last thing is that he leaned into jankiness, so he wasn't very good at animating, so instead he made it extra bad. When he first tried to animate a character, it looked so terrible that he was just like, you know what, I don't think I can make it better, but I think I can make it worse. And this ended up being a selling point of the game, because turns out it's really funny if everything is purposefully terrible. It's a little bit of a cop-out, but yeah, if you can't do it well, maybe you could turn it into a strength and reconsider, right? And the last, well, one of the last ones that I'm going to go over is Helldivers 2. This one is really mainstream now, so I think most of you know about it. The developer was behind stuff like Magicka, and from the very beginning, they were into systemic madness. Magicka, I think, is very similar to Lethal Company and all these things. If you haven't played that game, it was a game where all of you are wizards, and all your spells are cast by having different elements that are bound to different keys of the keyboard. So you could cast any spell that you learn the combination of by just typing it out. And of course, again, most of them would kill your friends, and if you get the wrong spell, you could have disastrous outcomes. And it had a lot of systemic interactions. For example, if you are wet and you cast a lightning spell, it's going to be a bad time for you. If your friend has explosive gas that he's casting and you cast a fireball, it's going to be a bad time for both of you. And stuff like this made sure that a small team with very little content could create a super engaging multiplayer game that people are replaying over and over. And this applied even more to Helldivers 2. I mean, fundamentally, it's an in-house game where all you do is run around and shoot bugs or robots. Most of the guns are pretty similar. Most of their procedural system is pretty generic. So how did this become a super hit? I mean, it's one of the most basic shooting games you can imagine. Regular mission-based structure, nothing impressive about visuals or procedural stuff. Just that everything came together. They knew a really clever way to package it. They didn't overemphasize the narrative, but they still had a very strong identity leaning into the Starship Troopers vibe and democracy above all and all of these exaggerations of modern culture. And they built on their legacy tech, and you will see this coming up as I wrap up with the final few examples. If you are a studio that made a few good games, don't just dramatically pivot from that. Try to build on your tech. Magicka has very little in common with Helldivers, but they adapted a lot of the technology from that, and they focused on the stuff they were already good at to improve it. Earlier, we had a talk talking about development in Japan. This is one of the reasons Japanese games are so good. They build on their tech. Whether it's Elden Ring or Super Mario or whatever, it's not just people that have worked on it for 20 years, it's 20 years worth of tech and lessons. So don't dramatically shift and try to think, this cool thing in the last game, how can we adapt it to the new one? And yeah, in their case, again, they made it intentionally very easy to fail and very easy to kill your teammates, which in most games would just be incredibly frustrating, right? You can easily kill yourself. Even requesting new resources can kill you. Friendly fire is on at all times and you cannot switch it off. These are things that would be horrible in a different context, but it was the entire selling point of this game. So just, I know I'm beating the dead horse, but it's still twitching a little bit, so please think about adding friction to games, making them a little bit more intentionally deliberate, making sure the player doesn't fall asleep, and I promise you, you're underestimating players and you should give them a little bit more respect. They will learn it, they will adapt, and they will actually end up loving it much more than the extremely streamlined mainstream stuff that we've been pumping out. And once again, a game that was actually Sony's best-selling game ever on PC. This one, not Spider-Man, not God of War, not Last of Us, a game where dudes shout for democracy and you shoot bugs over and over. Okay. Slight little curveball. If you ever want to talk to me after this, we can dive into this a little bit deeper, but there's a game that me and a lot of designers are obsessed with. It's called Fear and Hunger. I'm just going to skip over this one because it's insane and I'm going to need a whole separate talk. But it's a solo dev, and the entire design is based on a concept from Silent Hill 4 that's called hostile design. The game is purposefully, well, it hates you. The game hates you, and you can feel it. So it's a very interesting direction that I think is not explored enough. We tend to make games very friendly to the player, but I mean, this game has 50 videos with 5 million views on YouTube, and he made millions and millions off of a game that literally hates you at every single point. You cannot even save this game without risking death and losing hours of progress. So common sense would tell you that people would uninstall this and give it 1 out of 5 and send some hate mail to developers. No, people loved it. They absolutely loved it. They loved that the game was respecting them enough to challenge them. And when they do succeed, when they do learn, it's just that much more exciting. And this is the final part of the talk, where I'm just going to go over a few titles that I think are the golden standard of adapting simulation and respect for the player and a little bit of thought into different contexts. Red Dead Redemption 2 is our biggest budget possible example of this. And it has a lot of cutscenes, it has a lot of narrative focus, but still they kept their strengths and they focused on what they did. So they developed their engine and they expanded in crazy ways. They might not have done the most creative or surprising things, but they knew there was one thing they could do that nobody else could, which is have unparalleled fidelity. So stuff like every bird you hear is an actual bird in the environment, or things like this, like why would you do this? If this was the only case, that would be correct. However, when the entire game is based around this, suddenly this becomes the identity of it. How many videos have you seen with people doing crazy things in GTA or Red Dead, where the world responds in some unexpected way or an NPC reacts to you, it becomes the entire selling point. And this is done in one of the arguably most mainstream titles and developers in the world. And they still manage to find a way to do it. And a lot of people copy them. And they just completely, I think, managed to forget that one of the reasons those games became so popular was because of this interactivity and the systemic interactions. And it also shows that this stuff is completely compatible with even the most over-budgeted AAA stories. So it doesn't mean that if you're making a systemic game, it cannot be a narrative game. You can totally make those work, probably more elegantly than them, but still, can't argue with the reviews, reception, or sales of Red Dead 2. Next one is Elden Ring, the bane of my existence as somebody who's making a Souls-like. Another company that for 30 years have been doing the same thing, and they fundamentally respect the player. When Demon's Souls and Dark Souls came out, they had completely obscure control schemes for players, Armored Core as well. If you ever played Armored Core on PlayStation 1 or 2, they didn't even use the second stick. They just refused. Like when you were playing Armored Core 2, everybody was moving the camera. They were just like, nope. And this, again, sounds insane, but it became their trademark. And eventually people adapted, and now they love those control schemes. A lot of people copy them. They've created entire genres out of it because they respected people enough to tell them, okay, we're doing our own thing. It's weird. It's uncommon. But we trust that you will learn it eventually and that you will appreciate it with time. And this allowed them to even adapt it to different contexts. And with Elden Ring, they did their first ever open world game. And fundamentally, Elden Ring was really praised for being so different and new, but it's not. It's an Ubisoft open world game. You fight the same dragon 20 times. There's generic caves everywhere. The difference is how they framed it. They were very smart in it, so they took their same approach to designing the core of the game to the open world. So the difference is in Assassin's Creed, every cave, you see it on the map, which means that 5 minutes of cave content turns into 15 minutes because you have 5 minutes to go there, 5 minutes to go out, you spend time in menus. In Elden Ring, you kind of bump into stuff, and it feels like you're an explorer and you discover these things. So they knew that how you frame and contextualize stuff can completely change how players perceive it. Again, please try to look through the content of Elden Ring, and you will realize that it really is the exact same open world game that everybody else has been making. They just made it harder, they respected you a bit more, and they were not afraid of you missing content. And this made all the difference. And also they have crazy systemic stuff, so I love that you can completely do things like this, and it allows them to make a game about samurais, make a game about robots, make whatever they want, because they build all these systemic bits that make you really flexible with ideas or genres. Because fundamentally, they all use the same components of AI or combat. Tears of the Kingdom, same thing, gonna gloss over this very fast. They made a sequel, and they used the same map. It's absolutely insane. They didn't even improve the visuals or anything. They just focused on the one thing that players loved, which was interactivity, and they went crazy with it. And again, amazing critical reception, one of the best games of that year, and players loved it, even though a business person would say, why would anyone buy this? It's basically the same map, it's the same graphics. It's not a meaningful enough upgrade. But turns out nobody was playing the game for those reasons. And a meaningful upgrade sometimes looks like attaching a giant rock to a stick and making every single programmer in your team cry every time you suggest a new system. And it ended up working out. And the very last one that I'm going to mention is Baldur's Gate 3. I know it's fairly obvious, but this is basically Deus Ex mixed with Baldur's Gate, and I love it for it. Again, it shows that you build on your existing foundations. From the very first game that Larian made, it was always a systemic genre. Even their very first kind of Diablo-esque clone, you could move around boxes, you could mess with NPCs and routines, and they just kept building on this for years and years and years, and eventually it culminated in one of the best received games of the last year. I believe it broke all records for winning awards, and I think it goes to show. And fundamentally, it's D&D. It's a turn-based game with a lot of mechanical complexity. You can mess up in a lot of ways. You can mess up romances, you can get characters killed, your friend can push your legendary sword into a pit and you lose it forever. And yet somehow, contrary to common publisher logic, people loved it. They engaged with it, even though everything is moving away, whether it's Dragon Age or other RPGs, into making things more streamlined, more immediate and reactive because they're terrified of too much complexity, too much requirements on players. Turns out, completely wrong, but also it helps if you have really sexy characters that are basically 80% of the reason people play these games. Okay, takeaways, just a quick recap. Lean into your strengths, please. Don't go to different directions and try and do something radically different. Think about what's the best thing about you as a designer, creator, studio, whatever, and lean into that hard. Don't underestimate tech. It's going to fuck you up. Whether it's, oh, we're going to use this new tech and we've never tested it before, please test it first. Don't chase trends, okay? By the time your thing comes out, the trend will be gone. Nowadays, things move really fast, so this is basically a guaranteed death sentence, in my opinion. You need to be a trendsetter, not the one who chases it. And quality above all. I've spoken a lot about this with the Larian guys, and I think it's a very smart way that they think about it. They said that every single game they make, they start at a 90 Metacritic and above target. Obviously, just roughly, because Metacritic itself is questionable. But it means that they understand that the difference between a low Metacritic and high Metacritic game is exponential in terms of sales and reception. So you're better off making a smaller game and never compromising on anything rather than being like, okay, this is like fine, this is fine. You can make decent games like this, but if you truly want to make one of the greats of all time, you need to aim really, really high and try not to compromise because, trust me, it is extremely worth it, as you can see. And just get weird with it. Like, don't be afraid to change things, whether it's a control scheme or breaking genre conventions, making a game that's hostile to the player or just bizarre. Trust me, 90% of the time, it's absolutely worth it. And that's it. I'm done. I promise. I'm done talking. Thank you very much.
Thank you. No, it was already interesting. If you keep going, no one will insist. Okay, so we have some time, as this is the last session for today. So do some of you have some questions? No, really? Okay, but let me ask you something.
Okay.
So you mentioned that you need to do a lot of playtest to maybe find out your best core mechanic to improve it and make it like the center of your game. But I think it's not enough to maybe to do some just beta testing. So what do you think about early access? Because I think it feels like now every game launches in early access, even not saying that, because it feels like that. For example, like Cyberpunk, for example, or Starfield. It feels like the game is good, it's complete, but it's missing something. And
that's true.
Yeah, and many developers just improve it over time. But even like, for example, also Rogue, Price Versa, it's also, okay, it looks like indie. It's early access, but it's Ubisoft still, and they're still trying this. So what do you think about that? Maybe this is the future, or maybe this is also the
It depends.
How to deal with it?
Early access is tricky. I would advise developers to be cautious with it because statistically, early access hurts most games because you take away from your launch. And if you're not really big, you run the risk of whatever people's initial impressions are of your early access launch is what sticks with you. And nobody goes back to improve the games. I mean, even the biggest titles in the world, the amount of people I've had tell me that they didn't play Cyberpunk because it was too broken and they were going to wait, and then they just never end up playing it. If one of the most marketed games of all time can pull it off, you probably can. So be very cautious with it, but I still think for certain genres, if your game is mechanically complex, 100%. Something like Baldur's Gate 3, if you played the original launch compared to their final 1.0, the difference is immense because they got all the feedback because it was such an elaborate title. So I think it depends on how well known you are and what kind of game you're making. If it's a bit more mechanically dense, then absolutely. Otherwise, you're probably better off doing playtests instead.
Yeah, but on the other side, you can use your release as another marketing stuff. So just try to bring more people back, maybe.
Conceptually, yes. From any kind of metrics that I've seen, it doesn't end up working out, unfortunately. Okay. It's a nice fantasy, though.
Yeah, but I think we're talking about the games that, the developers that really improved the game. I think in this case, it works better in the end.
Oh, in this way, yes. Yeah. Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, maybe someone has a question? Okay, so, yeah.
Thank you for your talk. It was very insightful. Coming more about the early access, what are your thoughts about community-driven development? Because that's when we have some community, we can iterate and really find out what the player wants. So that's one opinion about the early access. And what are your thoughts about like community-driven development?
Community-driven, no. community collaborative, yes. I think community-driven is a scary term because it kind of implies that they're making decisions for you. And one of the things with player feedback is players are almost always right when there is a problem, and they're almost always wrong about what the problem actually is. So it's very good to listen to people, and they're a very good barometer of whether something works or not. But you will need to provide the solutions. They're very good at giving you the problems and highlighting them. But I still think, yeah, it's an awesome way, and I think if you can get away with it, whether it's early access or some other approach, it almost always makes the games better. Especially if you're smaller and, Valve can afford 50 playtests, but those cost money and organization. And yeah, if you're a smaller game especially, it really helps. And if you do it well, it also is organic marketing, because if you work with community and you please them and they see that you listen and you care, they will spread the word and it will really help your title.
Okay, more questions? Okay. Yeah, I think this is the last one for today.
Yes, please.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. You mostly showcased like AAA games or well-known games. Wanted to ask, what's your opinion about indie games that try to simulate a lot of stuff and basically like offload some of the gameplay elements onto a lot of simulation, basically? Like Dwarf Fortress or RimWorld, games like that.
I think it's a very interesting direction, because one of the cool things about simulation stuff is it's very front heavy. It takes a lot of time to set it up before it works in any reasonable capacity. But once you've done it, it generates content on its own. So paradoxically, if you can get over that initial hurdle, if you think you have the technical ability or whatever to create those systems, it actually works even better for small teams, because it allows you to have so much more content and variety without necessarily having to generate bespoke content and instead letting the systems interact. Like Dwarf Fortress, Kenshi, all of these kinds of weird systemic games have near infinite replayability, because once they're set up, it's just fun to poke around with them. But you need to be sure you have the technical ability to create those systems, because again, the initial setup is very difficult, and that can easily kill your entire project.